Welcome to Civic Punks, and I'm here with my good friend Almero. Almero, you are based in Cape Town, South Africa, and work in health. Tell me a bit about what you're doing.
So I'm South African born and bred. I am a medical doctor, qualified over 20 years ago. It's scary to say that, but over 20 years ago. And I did mostly clinical service related management work for just over 2 decades. Most of that as a specialist ER physician, ran or co-ran a large urban emergency center or ER in Cape Town. I'm pathologically curious about everything. So in that time, I was also a divisional education fellow, worked in Zambia and Tanzania with the African Federation of Emergency Medicine in some education design things, but tragically interested in making the world a better place and just about naive enough to think that it's possible. And so over the last few years, I've transitioned to a different role. So while I still do clinical work, primary role now is as the clinical lead for improvement and innovation in a directorate within our provincial Department of Health called the Directorate for Clinical Service Improvement, where our mandate is to find opportunities and challenges that affect service delivery at scale and see if we can make it stick and do some good things in the world. So that's what I'm interested in.
Well, and I think that sort of career path actually does a really good job of providing context to what I'm really keen to talk with you about. And this is based on a conversation you and I had actually, I think, a week or two ago. And that's how you've had experience both on, and continue to have experience on the front line as a practicing physician, while at the same time spending more and more times in the back office looking at more large-scale systemic responses for health. And one of the things we talked about is how those two different worlds are really interdependent, but at the same time work at different paces and different environments. And so the way I often think about it is the story I had with my brother, where my brother works on the front line. He spends his morning working on the front lines of the housing crisis here in Kitchener-Waterloo in Canada. And then he spends his afternoons working with City Hall and with the councillors and chief of police to come up with systemic solutions to these problems. And one of the things he always talks about is how it's such different worlds, that the front lines, there's a sense of urgency, there's a sense of immediacy, things need to be solved right now, and if they don't, the stakes are people's lives. And on the back end, you're looking at things from a bigger picture from 10,000 feet up, trying to create large-scale systemic solutions that scale and can impact lots and lots and lots of people. And there's such a disconnect between those two different worlds. So how have you seen those two realities play out in your own life, and how have you tried to navigate that?
There are so many dimensions to the disconnect between the frontline and the office environment. And so there's no way that we can cover all of that. I think it's a lifetime of work, and it's been many lifetimes of work thinking and writing about it. But I think you're absolutely right that there is a genuine felt and operational difference between the intensity and urgency at the front line, so in the service environment, than in the office environment. So I spent most of my life in the front line, so in the operational environment, doing emergency medicine, which is a high pressure, high risk, high pace, place to work. And in those kinds of environments, pressure is felt now. It's visceral. It's in your face. It's overcrowding. It's equipment breaking, stuff happening now. And so the intensity is very high, and also it's inescapable. It's not like you can go and have a nice long business lunch somewhere. You're there are citizens to be served. So you have this real pressure cooker of intensity and urgency. The time frames at which things are issues in that domain is minutes to hours, maybe days. So to give you a practical example, in a busy emergency center, if your EKG machine for doing heart tests breaks, you need one immediately. So not multiple shifts, not a procurement cycle, not a budget cycle. I need one now because I have 3 people with chest pain waiting for me and I can't do anything about that. And so on the other hand, where I find I spend most of my majority now, which is the office environment, which is the place that's supposed to build, maintain, and strengthen the symptoms. Well, maybe there's something in that Freudian slip, but the systems where citizens are served, it's very different. Firstly, the intensity, the felt intensity is very different. The highest intensity thing you might get is a strongly worded email about a deliverable or a deadline that you're missing, or maybe an awkward meeting. But that intensity of stake of a citizen that is vulnerable, that is in trouble right now, that is absent. And the urgencies and also the intensity is escapable. There's rhythms in these days. I'm doing some policy work, I'm doing some systems work, I've got an engagement now, then I'm taking a call, then I have like a working lunch or whatever else. And so the intensity is very different. And the urgency is also very different. So in the systems environment, people think in terms of policy cycles, orders, budget cycles, procurement cycles, permission cycles. And so here things unfold over weeks, months, and even years. And so we're going to unpack that with you, but I think that those two lived realities represent such profoundly different places that regardless of all the other things you try and do to connect the office world and the real world, that difficulty in meshing is just like oil that you smear on everything and it catches fire if you're not careful.
So I guess the question is, so what? Why does this matter? Why does this tension between these two worlds cause problems? Why should we care about this?
My reflections are my own here, I think, which is important. And I have a relatively unique perspective on this because it's actually very rare for people with significant service exposure to end up in systems strengthening, in my context at least, and vice versa. Career divergence tends to happen quite early. And so I'm in an unusual situation. Firstly, let's take it from the point of view of the public servant working at the front line, experiencing this intensity and urgency and looking into the eye of the citizen. And when they reach around to the system that should have the tools and the support and the stuff that they need, it's not there. Or certainly it's not there to the degree, i.e. the intensity that they need it. And it's not there to the urgency, i.e. in the time frame that they need it. So that's a major problem just from a mechanistic point of view. So from a service provision point of view. So if we go back to our EKG machine, like if my EKG machine breaks and I don't have one today and I miss a heart attack and that guy dies and now there's a family without a dad. So obviously there are outcome problems there. But the specific thing that I want to talk about is what that does to a public servant's trust and perception about the organization that they belong to. Because, fool me once, fool me twice, but eventually, if the pattern that you become used to is being in urgent, intense environments and reaching around and not getting the response that you need, you really have only one of three conclusions that you can make. Either you have to conclude that the system that needs to support you is incompetent. So it's incompetent and incapable. It cannot help you. So that's the one possibility. The other possibility is that it's uncaring. It could, but we're not going to. And the third one is that it might be malevolent. So like it could and it can, but it just won't for whatever reason. None of these things are necessarily true. I'm talking about how this is experienced. And so I think that eventually most people will either leave, which is probably the rational thing to do, or it hardens your relationship against the system. Because if, we all say that the world teaches you what is true. And in this case, the world has taught that person, and I am and was one of those people, that either these people don't know what they're doing or they don't care or they care about doing bad things to you. And none of those three relationships with the system is conducive to trust, collaboration, cooperation, or anything else. And people tend to either leave or shut down. They're just going to survival mode. Or unfortunately, and this is very true in healthcare, where people genuinely care about the citizens, the patients that they serve, it is a very powerful contributor to moral distress, moral injury, and burnout, which we know is caused by pouring yourself out, doing something that doesn't mean anything anymore, or being in a place where you feel to be genuinely alone, where you need someone to have your back. And so I think from a frontline worker point of view, those are probably some of the reasons why it's important. It affects citizens, but you erode the relationships and eventually the relationship with your staff, with public service, and eventually just erode them. And they go away or they remain in a less functional state.
That makes a lot of sense, and I can see that in lots of different places, including, like I mentioned, my brother's world in the housing sector, because any place where there's a crisis, right? That's where you get a lot of this intensity. I guess the question is like, okay, let's put on the other hat. So now front office. What's this perspective from the front office on all this?
Yeah, so I mean, now experiencing that, well, I'm not as experienced in that, but I'm now. And it's been it is a real journey for me to go through that. So initially when I moved to my current role, I was angry and frustrated a lot because I thought, well, I've intentionally positioned myself as part of the machinery that I felt had not responded for all those years. Because I thought I'm going to give it a go and see if I can make a difference. And then you can't, or it starts off like you have control, but then the moment it's outside of your control, it slows down. So I think for many people in office environments, many people who do genuinely care and have at least some understanding of the urgency and intensity at the front line, it can be as disillusioning to realize that I am part of a machine that cannot respond to the degree or at the speed that the people who need us need us. So I've certainly experienced that, and it has all the same downsides as that kind of realization might have for the server, especially for people who've never worked in an operational environment, who had only very basic exposure to it. Sometimes they just don't get it. And the feedback that they get from the operational environment, unless they physically go there, becomes mythology. You know, these people are always complaining about how busy it is. It's all we ever hear. Yep, yep, yep. We need more of this. We want more of that. We want more stuff. Yep, yep, yep. They don't know what they're talking about. And so in a weird way, there's this protective alienation that you allow. Because the alternative is almost unthinkable, isn't it? Unless you're able to convince yourself that the feedback that we're consistently getting from the urgent, intense front line is mythology, you're forced to believe that you're not responding to something that you should be responding to. And I mean, this is a subconscious thing. It's not like, people are actively deciding to, but our hearts protect themselves, don't they? And
Mhm.
so, again, if I feel powerless to do anything about it, then I can either continue the moral distress of being powerless about it, or maybe subconsciously I have to start believing in an alternative narrative that protects my heart from this. And then you can get, again, most of the time, I mean, this is not malevolent and there's not bad people at all. It's just an interesting structural consequence of this disconnect is that you then start getting sanctuary effect. Being in the office environment with these slow things and having brainstorming sessions and policy writing for the 20th revision and blah, 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 it's much more comfortable and safe and secure and predictable and less upsetting than being in the front. And so you become less and less likely to want to spend time in that, particularly if you don't feel that you have the ability to do anything about it. And so in the same way that you have really good people in the operational environment that can eventually become harmed and even become dysfunctional or have a less than positive impact on the system just because of that, in the same way the thing happens at the other side. And so over time, the net effect is a hardening of the line between people in the service environment and people in the office environment that is messy and multidimensional and not easy to just address as such. And that then further frustrates any potential efforts that you might have to try and connect those two.
I think I definitely agree with all this, and I think some things I want to sort of throw into the pot as well, because I think I've probably spent more time in the back office space than I have in the front office space. And one thing is like some of the thinking behind it is like when you're in the back office space, you are slower moving, but also moving a bigger thing, right? So in the front office, you're talking about, can I save this person's life? Whereas in the back office, you're like, can I create this policy or this program that saves these thousands of lives, right?
Mm,
Any misstep that I make, the consequences are much bigger, right? If I make a misstep here, this person dies. If I make a misstep here, these thousands of people die. And so I think because of the scale, there's a tendency to like want to slow down and do it right. Because there's a recognition that the consequences could be much greater and also slower to fix. I think you also end up in a situation where you have to deal with trade-offs and scarce resources at the same time. And so you're balancing the need to provide supports for the front lines with a need to work within the limits of the resources you have. And those limitations work on the front lines as well, but I think they play out a bit differently because of the intensity of it. And part of the idea of the reason why we sort of separate the front office and the back office, I think to a certain extent, is that is to move out of the urgency, because the fear is that the urgency will stop us from thinking creatively. We'll just react instead of being proactive, right? So it's like the classic metaphor of like walking by the river and there's a baby in the river. Like, why is this baby in the river heading towards the waterfall? So you quickly grab and pull the baby out of the river, and then you see another baby and then another baby. And the people on the front line are just pulling the babies out of the river, whereas the people in the back are like, wait a second, why are there babies in the river in the first place? And that requires a certain level of distance, a certain level of perspective that being in a back office provides. So that's the argument for why the back office, I think, works the way it does. The risk is that in creating that separation, you lose perspective, you lose urgency. And I think that's one of the tensions is that I think we've created too much of a gap between the front and the back. And that leads to distrust. It leads to all the stuff that you just talked about. So distrust, ineffectiveness, all these different things. Does that make sense from what you're seeing in your perspective?
It definitely does. And I think it's such a beautiful example of the fact that two things can be true at the same time. No, it can be true that the disconnect between the front and the back office is necessary. And it can also be true that the disconnect in the way that it's manifested is harmful. And then a third thing can also be true, which is, well, maybe there's a better way to do it. And so I think that dialectic, that resolution of a tension paired to a third truth or an additional truth is really useful. And I think there are ways to move towards that. So just responding to what you were saying about, for instance, trade-offs. I think the consistent voice from people in the operational environment is, well, if you're making the trade-offs, then please communicate it to citizens and own the consequences there are. Because this was my reality for the longest time. I'm working in an emergency center where I'm running on average 200% occupancy with 3 day stays in the emergency center, and 2/3 of our people are on the floors or on chairs. It's pretty rough. I've got no control over that. I've got no control over the amount of people that are coming into me. I also have no control over saying no. I have to help everyone. And then if the sector manager receives a patient complaint or a family complaint that relates to conditions or waiting time, please don't send that to me because I can't do anything about that. The best that I can do is to say we're trying the best that we can in a highly constrained environment. And I'm really sorry for your experience. But the 20th time you start saying that, it contributes to that moral distress. If a system decides, for instance, it's really important for us to invest in cataract surgery and hip replacements because it adds dramatic quality of life, duration of life, and economic activity to the lives of people, but we're going to draw back on limb-conserving surgery for diabetics. So if you're a diabetic over the age of 65 and you've got a bad foot, we're not going to spend 2 months trying to save that foot. We're just going to take it off at the right level and give you a really good prosthetic. So if that is a fictional scenario, but if that trade-off is made, then the owner of the trade-off needs to also own the consequences of the trade-off. You cannot separate the place where decisions are made and the place where the consequences of those decisions are played out so profoundly and consistently and expect there to be that everyone's going to buy into the vision. So that would be the one reaction. And then I also think that just like the operational environment is more than one thing, the back crew is more than one thing as well. There's the policy and strategy sphere, there's the tactical layer, there are program managers, there's middle managers. And I think along that spectrum, not all is equal in terms of how the degree of abstraction that is desired or even allowed. Having said that, I think it is incredibly important that we create opportunities for those two, let's call it capabilities. So let's call it the system needs a reactive capability. The system must be able to take the baby out of the river. But the system also needs a reflective and corrective capability. The system must be able to figure out why the babies are in the water and stop that from happening. But it must have both. And the split must be reasonable and rational. And whoever decides that split must own the consequences of that split. So that would be my reflection on that. We can have some conversations on other ways to bring those two worlds together. But yeah.
Well, I think a good place to start then as we dive more into the solutions is to sort of ground it in your own life and your own experience, right? So you work on the front lines, but you've also made the decision to spend some time at more of the back room space. Why? What pulled you into that space, and what keeps you there?
Well, so the
Because you
first
hold
thing
that
is,
tension internally.
yes, the first thing is that my full-time job now is in the back office. So my 8 to 5, Monday to Friday is in the back office. I still do one night every week and one weekend every month of clinical work. And I do that voluntarily. So I mean, I get paid for it, but it's not a job requirement of mine. It's something that I decided to do. In part because, I mean, I did it for a long time. I'm good at it and I enjoy it. I enjoy the less toxic parts of it. I love people. I love being able to help people. So remaining involved on the clinical side certainly feeds a very important part of who I am and who I've become over time. But my interest is in making it easier for good people to do good things. Customers are frontline servants. Their customers are citizens. So when I'm in the emergency center, my customer is the citizen. But when I'm in the back office, my customer is the frontline clinician. And so maintaining relevant exposure and time in the operational environment is an extremely important way for me to sense make and gather data and maintain networks that can help me understand what is necessary for me to make it easier for good people to do good things. So part of it I do it because I like it. Part of it I do because it's an important part of being able to do my job. It's a choice to remain connected to that. And I think that there are places that are moving to structural solutions that allows this. The one example that I can think of is it's my understanding, I haven't fact checked this, but it's my understanding from colleagues in the public health world that in Australia and New Zealand to retain registration as a public health specialist practitioner, you are required to do a minimum number of hours of patient-facing work. I think it's 8. So it means that out of your 5-day work week, one of those days is not an office day working on clinical projects. It's a clinical office day sitting in front of patients and see. And so I think that it's something that I'm really interested in is what are the structural interventions that we could consider that supports the cultural shift that we need, which is a higher degree of empathy in both directions between the operational world and the back office world, and then flowing from that empathy, better design and better intervention choices.
And I think we talked about this last time. One of the things that, to that end, that you're quite interested in exploring and seeing how to do is almost like having secondments, where people do like a micro secondment from operations into sort of more of the backroom space and backrooms into more of the operation space.
Yeah, so the idea is micro secondments. We're hoping to run our first iteration of it. It's probably happening in other places already. This is just our own thoughts. But the idea is the following, is that particularly in high intensity, high urgency service environments, you have effective structural exclusion of those folks from the machinery of the system. So the people that are working in the clinics, in the hospitals, in the front rooms, in the office, in the citizen facing, they're just too busy. They don't have the luxury of attending multiple corporate events or taking part in project brainstorming or whatever else. And so it's a lost voice. It's a black box of networks and experience and insights and talent and creativity and desire. It's a black box that's gone. And so you end up in this place where it's all or nothing. I either work in the service environment or I have to move full time to something else or a long-term secondment. A micro secondment is, well, let's do it project specific. So let's say my team is working with a primary healthcare clinic team, and the issue that we're really interested in exploring is solving the issue around how can we get accurate, up-to-date contact details for our patients, and how can we increase contactability for them, particularly when they're coming to us and we do a test. Let's say we do a test for tuberculosis. The result isn't available immediately, so that patient goes. 2 days later, I need to let them know either way, and now I can't reach them because the contact details have eroded or whatever else. It's a major challenge in our and in many other developing countries. So instead of sitting in an office, I would go to the clinic and I say, well, who's your person who's going to run this? Like who's got the juice for this? And they say, well, I want them a day a week or 3 days a week or 2 half days a week or a week a month or whatever it is for the duration of the project. So I'm going to extract them from the operational environment to the project environment to really work intensely with us on this. And then critically, I'm going to replace their absence in the operational environment on the project's budget, not on the service environment's budget. Because otherwise, I am forcing that facility to make a decision between a much lower level of participation in our project or fully committing and then leaving a big service gap. And if your environment is anything like mine, we're not on the bone, my friend. We're deep under the bone. There's no room to spare someone for X amount of time for them to cruise around. And so sometimes, this is maybe a bit cynical, but sometimes they spare the person that they're least interested in having in the operational environment. So you're not necessarily getting the best person, or they just can't say. So I think that there are opportunities for us to consider lower commitment risk microsecondments as a structural solution to start building connections and therefore empathy and therefore consistent behavior and therefore culture between these two worlds.
Yeah, I think that idea makes a lot of sense. This is where I've seen similar type of things happen. One thing that was interesting for me was the ones that had the most success added a layer of support for the people doing the secondment, because you're moving from one work culture, work way of doing things to one that's quite different. And that shift can be very jarring. And without supports in place, it can be very overwhelming. And so if this goes badly, you have a case where actually the people who've done this secondment come back even more bitter and upset about the relationship.
Yeah.
So there's almost like a need for, I'm just thinking the government of Lithuania has their Create Lithuania program, and that's something that they focused on, was making sure that the person doing the secondment in government had a support team, peers, mentor, someone to just help them navigate just the cultural change from one world to the other, which I think is really important. The challenge, of course, with all of this is this all of a sudden starts to become very expensive. That I think is why we don't see more of this type of stuff, is that, you were referring to the amount that, cut beyond the bone, as you were saying. I think that's true everywhere, back office and sort of front office operations. And so I think because of that, there is the view that this type of program is a luxury. Now, I would argue that the impact of it, in a long term, is such that it's much greater. It's worth the luxury, if you will. I don't think it's a luxury. I think it's a necessity. But I think that does require a certain level of visionary leadership on the part of organizations to implement that. But that's definitely, I think you need to have that support in place. Otherwise, you could actually look at making the problems worse.
I think that that's very wise on both counts. So the first count is, I think that these kinds of reconstituted team projects, microsecondments, should be a curated experience, supported in a guided experience. And that's something that we have some thoughts on and that we're really interested to learn. Who was it? Mike Tyson that said, everyone has a plan until I punch them in the face. And so we've certainly learned that you can have plans, but you have to be there and allow the world to at least try and punch you in the face and then see. So I'm very interested to see what types of experience curation is useful for these kinds of microsecondments. And then in terms of investing in it or not, there's a cliche all over the world. I'm sure you guys say it as well, which is, well, it is what it is. And in our unit, we hate that. You're not allowed to say that. What you have to say is, it takes what it takes. And it's only when you don't do, or you won't do, or you can't do what it takes, well, then it is what it is. And so I think that there's enough in this idea to, at the very least, invest the resources in finding out if and how it works. Otherwise, you just have potentially very, very expensive, entrenched, lower ROI approaches that just persist forever, which isn't useful.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And one of the other things that sort of comes to mind is you sent me an article on innovation, I think like a month ago. I'm finally getting around to reading it. And one of the things that it's a really good article. I'm actually going to create a video about it. But one of the things the article talks about is that real innovation comes from being right out there on the front lines, right? You need to have, it's really hard to come up with innovative ideas if you're disconnected from the thing you're trying to innovate. That you need to have more teams on the front lines at the cold face of things, really experiencing the intensity of whatever it is you're trying to solve. And it's through that intensity and through spending time with lived experience of whatever it is you're trying to solve that actually that generates some really exciting innovations. And that a lot of the reasons why governments have struggled with innovation is that they've tried too much to put into the back office and disconnect from where the innovations are actually meant to be implemented. So the benefit of something like this is it opens doors for new and creative ideas to get into the water supply and then be scaled, because the back office is great at can be great at scaling if they get the right ideas.
And I think, again, for me, that it's important to realize that multiple things can be true at the same time and multiple roles can be necessary at the same time. I think that we should strive for better cohesion, coordination, balance, and connection in these different roles in massive organizations. And I think it's possible. I think it's something that we can that can be done. I don't think that we have to feel or be doomed to a fundamentally disconnected state machine as we try and make it easier for people to live lives of dignity and meaning as they define it, which I think is the purpose of government. The purpose of government is to make it easier for people to live lives of dignity and meaning as they define it. And there is no way that you can do that if you haven't broken bread with the people whose lives you're trying to. I'd go so far as to say that if you don't have significant service environment exposure, you cannot be a public sector innovator. So it's a provocative statement. You can be an innovation manager, no problem with that. You can be a policy innovator and all stuff like that. But the likelihood of a responsive, excellent, isolated innovation in the service environment, unless you yourself spend time there or have a core team member that does, is so low that in actual fact, it's an exclusion criteria for my team for project selection. We do not engage with frontline innovations unless one of the team is in that tribe, or at least unless someone from that tribe is a primary project member of it. Not only is it too likely to fail, but it's too likely to actually cause net harm.
Yeah, and so I don't lose it here. The article that you sent me is The New Rules of Innovation by Ian Montgomery. So there you go. I'm going to be making a video about it, but I wanted to give it a shout out here. Yeah, I think the doing harm part is interesting. And the thing that's sticking in my head as a visual for this, or like symbolism, is the idea that you have two gears that are moving at different speeds. And so you've got the front lines, the operations is moving really, really fast. And then you have the slower, so back office, which is much bigger, but moving much more slowly. And this sort of harkens to a guy named Gordon Guthrie, who's been writing a bunch about this stuff in Scotland. And he talks about how, inevitably that's true in every institution, that you have different parts that move at different speeds. And the challenge is having that gearbox that helps connect those two worlds effectively and translates between those two different speeds. Because if you don't have that, they just rub against each other, and it creates a lot of damage. And that lubricant that is needed to sort of help connect those two, and oftentimes is people. It's people that bridge those two worlds. And we talked about I'm going to have to look up the guy's name, but the leadership model, where, the idea of a leader is someone who has a foot on both of those gears and serves as the bridge, that they serve as the gearbox between those different worlds. And it's a really challenging thing to do. And I think, hats off to you for working on it. And I think having a foot in both worlds is really important.
I think it's an immensely important thing that you're touching on now. A lot of the stuff that we work on, we've had to develop our own language in, because I'm not a lifelong professional in this. I'm trying to do good stuff, but we would talk about connecting architecture as the intentional building and maintenance of the elements that connect these disparate areas in large organizations. And so we would often think about, so this conversation so far, particularly initially, and necessarily so, has been largely binary, isn't it? We're talking about the front office, we're talking about the back office, and we're talking about people who can spend a little bit of time there and spend a little bit of time here. And you might think in the same way about, citizens versus the government, or private sector versus public sector. So all of these, but I think that you can do a third domain intentionally in between those two things that we would call connecting architecture. And so if this is the public sector and this is the private sector, then the connecting architecture could be certain laws and stuff that allow it to happen, shared think tank, collaborative PPI units, and so on and so forth. And in the same way, I think that you're very right, is that a very important part of the connecting architecture between the front and the back office are the people that are able to step into that space. I'm really interested in beyond those people that tend to be the kind of outliers at the moment in many places. So beyond the individuals that are able to naturally or by force of will be connecting architecture, be the mesh between those two tiers, what are the things that we can do intentionally? What are the structural interventions that we can consider that builds the architecture, the scaffolding into which relationships and other things can twist like vines that then becomes the architecture in between. So connecting architecture is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about and working on because it delivers so much. It gives you back so much. Connecting architecture is also issue agnostic. So I might be bridging those two worlds for project A, but once connecting architecture is established, it's established, which means when we go to project B, it's there. The synapses are there and everything is just so much faster. So the first time it's some effort, but once you have it, it just makes everything so much easier.
Well, and I like the idea of connected architecture as well, because sort of digging into some behavioral economics here, that we so often talk about behavior being about willpower. And what the rise of behavioral economics has really taught us is that architecture is just as important, if not more important, than willpower.
Yeah.
People want to be connectors between these two worlds, but inevitably people revert back to the architecture and the context they sit within. So if you can actually build it into the context, it becomes sustainable, which I think is the interesting thing. When you think of that connective architecture, are there certain aspects, or what does it look like to you?
It can be so many different things. Just before I touch on that, we've got a little. So Terry Pratchett talks about dreadful arithmetic, which is the cold hard logic of how the world is. We don't necessarily want it. It's obviously satire, but one of our little dreadful arithmetic equations that we have is the likelihood of behavior equals value times convenience. I'm likely to do something, and I'm more likely to do it as I value it more, as it's easier. So convenience. And convenience outweighs value by about a factor of 1,000. So we don't effectively invest beyond some awareness. We invest zero time and resources in value engineering. We are almost exclusively interested in conditions engineering and convenience engineering as way better drivers of outcome, which comes back to my informal job description, which is just make it easier for good people to do good things, and they do. So connecting architecture, what does it look like? It's different in different places, but the major domains that I focus on when I'm thinking about it is firstly is relational elements. So the true nature of an organization is expressed in its relational networks. The nodes, the connections, the size, the directions, not the organogram, not the vision and mission statement, not the APP. It's the relational network. So investing in the relational networks and then maintaining and managing that, and primarily being interested in relational networks as a way for me to add value to others, not as a way for me to extract value from others, is very useful. So value additive relational networking is a much, much more joyful and effective strategy than value extractive relation. So relational networks is very, and the best way to build relationships is to be useful for other people, so to serve. Then beyond relational networks, there's sort of multiple. I had to go check it up again because I think we actually did develop a four level model on it. So relationships one. Then you get ad hoc, or let's say rather you get projects. So I might go out and build relational architecture sort of independently of projects, just because those are cool people and I think we need relationships here. But then you get projects. So whenever you're working with people, when the project is over, the thing doesn't have to be over. So there can be echoes and reverberations that remain in the form of project artifacts, but again, in the form of understanding empathy and relationship. The next level would be kind of ad hoc or sometimes time limited, more formal, semi-formal structures. So now we want to increase vaccine penetration in a specific sub-district, and we constitute a vaccine task force. So here the connecting architecture doesn't have to be everlasting, but the structural part, well, the relationships hopefully will, but the structural part of that is a task force, and it needs to be constituted with mandates and expectations and roles and responsibilities and budget and so on and so forth. And then another one up from these, let's say, ad hoc or task specific things is when you have actual formal collaborative forums. we see it all over the world, whole of government things or mission-based things. So maybe you have, so like in our country, we would have a community safety working group within government, which is a interdepartmental thing. It is actually chaired by the Department of Health with people from all over. And so you could have these more permanent transversal structures as well. I think the thing here is really, how do you helix the structural interventions in such a way that you keep in mind that the ultimate lasting currency is probably going to be the relational currency as it goes along. So in a weird way, you kind of have these three phases. In the initial phase, often think about a creeping plant, and it has those little tendrils that are swinging and just trying to find somewhere to hook on. And so in the first phase, that swinging tendril is often relationships, personal relationships, professional relationships. And then as it hooks, it starts building structure. So, the vine starts going. And so now we have the ad hoc forum or the task force or the working group or the project or whatever else. And as that gets consolidated now, new sheets are moving up and down, insects are moving up and down, all sorts of things are in there. And so then you have a second enriched relational element to that. So the relationship is often the first. Then you build the structure, and then that structure is populated by really wonderful, diverse relationships if you've done it well after the fact.
I mean, first off, it's a lovely imagery, so thank you for that. One of the things that I think a lot about this stuff is that how much of it is dependent upon relationships. And my fear is that sometimes we don't do the second, third part. And so what happens is someone retires or moves jobs or passes away or something, and they were such a pivotal, they played the role of the connective tissue. And because the architecture wasn't built around them, it's lost. It's all lost.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing, is we become overly dependent upon these few connectors, and we don't build the architecture around them because we just don't think to. Until they're gone, and then it's like, oh, what do we do now?
Yeah, it's such an important thing again, and I think that it's again and maybe it's sort of like almost a little sub theme of our conversation, which I'm really enjoying, by the way, so far, is this idea that many things can be true at the same time. And so it is true that particularly initially, the relational networks is the scaffolding of connecting architecture. But it's also true that relational networks without structural architectural interventions is very vulnerable. It's very powerful in the moment, very powerful. It's fast, but it's very vulnerable because exactly as you say, and we've all experienced that. I mean, I can think of a few in just a minute popping into the back of my head. Wonderful things have just stopped existing. Individuals or relationships stopped existing. So maybe that's an interesting thing for all of us in the public sector to think about. Again, I think intentionality is so important. But maybe that's a part of it, is when we come across or when we build relational connecting architecture, are we being intentional enough about tending to and taking care of that relational architecture, building the structural scaffolding around it that makes the relational stuff grow, but also makes it more resilient?
Yeah, I like that. Well, that might be actually a good place to wrap up this conversation. Well, thank you so much for making time, and keep me in the loop with how this microsecondment program that you are working on comes together, and I look forward to hanging out sometime in the near future.
Yeah, thank you so much, Derek. It's always so interesting to talk to you, and you're always generous with your time. So I said earlier that one of the best way to start to work on relational connecting architecture, or to think about it, is to ask yourself, how can I connect with people in a way that's of benefit to them? It doesn't have to be of benefit to me. That value exchange is value exchange. It's enough. And I think that I've experienced you certainly, and I know many others do, are so generous with adding value to others. And I'm really grateful for that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Almero. You're too kind. And you've been incredibly generous with me over the years as well. So it's a two-way street for sure.
There you go.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Almero.
Awesome. Okay. All the best. Bye.